e4. King's pawn opening. Knight h6. d4. g6. c4. f6. Hippopotamus defense. a5. Cornstalk defense. Knight a6. Lemming defense. f5. Fred. f6. Barnes defense. d4. King f7. Fried fox defense. h6. Cars defense. g5. Macho reversed grob. a6. St. George, Baker defense. b6. Own defense. d4. Bishop a6. Guatemala defense. Knight c6. King's pawn, Nimzovich defense. b4. Knight takes b4. c3. Knight c6. d4. Wheeler gambit. Knight f3. Nimzovich defense. f5. Colorado counter. d4. Nimzovich defense. d5. E takes d5. Queen takes d5. Knight c3. Marshall gambit. Knight c3. Bogoliubov variation. f6. Neo-Mongoloid defense. d5. Scandinavian, center counter defense. E takes d5. Queen takes d5. Knight c3. Queen a5. d4. Knight f6. Knight f3. Bishop g4. h3. Laska variation. Bishop f5. Scandinavian defense. Knight e5. c6. g4. Grunfeld variation. e5. Anderson counterattack. D takes e5. Bishop b4. Bishop d2. Knight c6. Knight f3. Anderson counterattack orthodox attack. Knight f3. Anderson counterattack, Göteborg system. Bishop g4. Collin variation. Mrs. Kotorf gambit. Queen d6. Piddle-Wade variation. Knight f6. Scandinavian defense. c4. e6. Icelandic gambit. c6. Scandinavian gambit. d4. Scandinavian defense. Knight takes d5. Marshall variation. c4. Knight b4. Kiel variation. g6. Richter variation. Knight f6. Alekhine's defense. Knight c3. d5. Scandinavian variation. e5. Knight fd7. e6. Spielmann variation. d3. Muratsi variation. Bishop c4. Krejcik variation. Knight f6. Alekhine's defense. e5. Knight e4. Buka variation. Knight g8. Brooklyn defense. Knight d5. Alekhine's defense. Bishop c4. Knight b6. Bishop b3. c5. d3. K-Moch variation. Knight c3. Same-ish attack. b3. Welling variation. c4. Alekhine's defense. Knight b6. b3. Steiner variation. c5. 2 pawns, Lasker's attack. Knight d5. Bishop c4. e6. Knight c3. d6. 2 pawns attack, McKenna's variation. d4. Alekhine's defense. b5. O'Sullivan gambit. d6. Alekhine's defense. Bishop c4. Ballo variation. c4. Alekhine's defense. Knight b6. He takes d6. Exchange variation. C takes d6. Knight f3. g6. Bishop e2. Bishop g7. Castle. Castle. h3. Knight c6. Knight c3. Bishop f5. Bishop f4. Karpov variation. f4. 4 pawns attack. D takes e5. F takes e5. Bishop f5. Knight c3. e6. Knight f3. Bishop e7. Bishop e2. Castle. Castle. f6. Kortnoy variation. Knight c6. 4 pawns attack. Knight f3. Bishop g4. e6. F takes e6. c5. Ilian Chanyevsky var. Bishop e3. 4 pawns attack. Bishop f5. Knight c3. e6. Knight f3. Queen d7. Bishop e2. Castle queenside. Castle. Bishop e7. Tartakower variation. g5. 4 pawns attack. Planets variation. g6. Fianchetto variation. Bishop f5. Trifonovic variation. Knight f3. Modern variation. D takes e5. Larsen variation. Knight b6. Modern, Schmidt variation. g6. Fianchetto variation. Bishop c4. Knight b6. Bishop b3. Bishop g7. a4. Keres variation. Bishop g4. Modern variation. Bishop e2. c6. Floor variation. h3. Panov variation. c4. Alekhine variation. Knight b6. d5. Vitolin's attack. g6. Robach, modern defense. d4. Knight f6. e5. Knight h5. g4. Knight g7. Norwegian defense. Bishop g7. Modern defense. f4. 3 pawns attack. Knight c3. Robach defense. c6. f4. d5. e5. h5. Urgenadze variation. d6. Modern defense. Knight f3. 2 knights variation. c6. Subtle's variation. f4. Pseudo-Austrian attack. d6. d4. Knight f6. Knight c3. Pirc Defence. c6. Afimtsov Piddle variation. g6. Pirc Defence. Bishop e3. c6. Queen d2. Pirc attack. g3. Sveshnikov system. Bishop c4. Whole move system. Bishop g5. Burn variation. Bishop e2. Pirc Defence. Bishop g7. g4. Chinese variation. h4. Bayonet attack. Knight f3. d6. c3. Geller's system. d6. d4. Knight f6. Knight c3. g6. Knight f3. Pirc Classical, 2 knights system. Bishop g7. Classical, 2 knights system. h3. Classical, h3. System. Bishop e2. Classical system, Bishop e2. f4. Austrian attack. Bishop g7. Knight f3. Castle. Pirc Austrian attack. e5. Austrian attack, d takes e5. Bishop e3. Austrian attack. Bishop d3. Austrian attack, bishop d3. c5. Austrian attack, dragon formation. Bishop c4. Lubojevich variation. c6. Caro-Kann Defense. Bishop c4. Hillbilly attack. c4. Anti-Caro-Kann Defense. d5. Anti-Caro-Kann Defense. d3. Caro-Kann, closed, Breyer variation. Knight c3. Caro-Kann Defense. d5. Queen f3. Goldman, Spielman variation. Knight f3. Caro-Kann, two knights variation. Bishop g4. Two knights, bishop g4. d4. Caro-Kann Defense. Knight a6. Knight c3. Knight c7. De Pirc Defence. Knight f6. Caro-Kann Defense. d5. Caro-Kann Defense. f3. Tartakower, fantasy variation. Knight d2. Caro-Kann, knight d2. Queen b6. Edinburgh variation. e5. Caro-Kann, advance variation. Bishop f5. c3. e6. Bishop e2. Short variation. E takes d5. Exchange variation. C takes d5. Bishop d3. Knight c6. c3. Knight f6. Bishop f4. Rubinstein variation. c4. Knight f6. c5. Gundram attack. Knight c3. Panov attack. Knight c6. Bishop g5. D takes c4. d5. Knight a5. Herzog defense. e6. Normal variation. Queen a5. Cherniak variation. Queen b6. Refer, Spielman variation. e6. Panov attack. g6. Panov attack. Knight c3. Caro-Kann Defense. b5. Urgenadze counterattack. g6. Urgenadze system. d takes e4. f3. Resistadier gambit. Knight takes e4. Caro-Kann Defense. Knight f6. Bishop d3. Alekhine gambit. Knight takes f6. E takes f6. Tartakower, Nimzovich variation. Bishop c4. Forgax variation. G takes f6. Bronstein-Larsen variation. Knight d7. Steinitz variation. Bishop f5. Classical variation. Knight g3. Bishop g6. Knight h3. Floor variation. f4. Muratsi attack. h4. Classical. h4. h6. Knight f3. Knight d7. Classical. Knight d7. h5. Spassky variation. c5. Sicilian Defence. c4. d6. Knight c3. Knight c6. g3. h5. Gloria variation. g3. Steinitz variation. b4. Wing gambit. C takes b4. c4. Sandasier variation. a3. Marshall variation. d5. E takes d5. Queen takes d5. Bishop b2. Marienbad variation. B takes a3. Carlsbad variation. Knight e2. Keres variation. f4. Grand Prix attack. d4. Smith-Morr gambit. Knight f3. e5. c3. Andrzejczyk gambit. c3. Smith-Morr gambit. d takes c3. Knight takes c3. Knight c6. Knight f3. d6. Bishop c4. e6. Castle. a6. Queen e2. b5. Bishop b3. Rook a7. Chicago defense. c3. Alekhine's variation. Knight f6. e5. Knight d5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Knight a3. Heidenfeld variation. Knight c3. Sicilian, closed. e6. g3. d5. Korchnoi variation. Knight c6. Sicilian, closed. Knight ge2. Chameleon variation. f4. Grand Prix attack. g6. Knight f3. Bishop g7. Bishop c4. e6. f5. Schaffman variation. g3. Sicilian, closed. g6. Bishop g2. Bishop g7. d3. e6. Bishop e3. Knight d4. Knight ce2. Smyslov variation. d6. Sicilian, closed. Knight ge2. e5. Botvinnik. f4. Sicilian, closed. e5. Sicilian, closed. f takes e5. Botvinnik. Bishop e3. Sicilian, closed. Knight f3. Sicilian defense. Queen a5. Snelletto, Althaus variation. Queen c7. Queen Taros variation. b6. Katalimov variation. g6. Hungarian variation. c4. Bishop h6. Acton extension. a6. O'Kelly variation. Knight f6. Nimzovich-Rubinstein variation. e5. Knight d5. Knight c3. e6. Knight takes d5. E takes d5. d4. Knight c6. Rubinstein counter gambit. Knight c6. Sicilian defense. Bishop b5. Nimzovich-Rasolimo attack, without d6. g6. Nimzovich-Rasolimo attack, with g6. Without d6. Castle. Bishop g7. Rook e1. e5. b4. Urgenadze variation. d4. Sicilian defense. c takes d4. Knight takes d4. Queen c7. Floor variation. d5. Nimzovich variation. e5. Labordine-Lowenthal variation. d6. Kalashnikov variation. Knight f6. Sicilian defense. Knight c3. e5. Caro-Kann, Lasker/Sveshnikov variation. Knight bb5. d6. Bishop g5. a6. Knight a3. Bishop e6. Caro-Kann, bird variation. b5. Caro-Kann, Chelyabinsk variation. Bishop takes f6. G takes f6. Knight d5. f5. Sveshnikov variation. g6. Knight takes c6. Sicilian, accelerated fianchetto, exchange variation. Knight c3. Accelerated fianchetto, modern variation. Bishop g7. Bishop e3. Knight f6. Bishop c4. Modern variation with bishop c4. c4. Accelerated fianchetto, Murat bind. Knight f6. Knight c3. Knight takes d4. Queen takes d4. d6. Gurgenidze variation. Bishop g7. Murat bind. Knight c2. d6. Bishop e2. Knight h6. Simagin variation. Bishop e3. Murat bind. Knight f6. Knight c3. Knight g4. Prayer variation. e6. Sicilian defense. d4. d5. Martial variation. C takes d4. Sicilian defense. Knight takes d4. Knight f6. Anderson variation. Knight c3. Bishop b4. Sicilian counter-attack. Bishop d3. e5. Pin, Jeffy variation. e5. Pin, Kutch variation. a6. Kann variation. c4. Murat bind, Reti variation. Knight f6. Knight c3. Bishop b4. Bishop d3. Knight c6. Bishop c2. Bramstein variation. Bishop d3. Sicilian, Kann. Knight f6. Castle. d6. c4. g6. Gypsless variation. Bishop c5. Pelagievsky variation. g6. Swiss cheese variation. Knight c3. Sicilian, Kann. Knight c6. Sicilian defense. Knight b5. Shin, Anti-Taimanov variation. c4. Knight f6. Knight c3. a6. Knight a3. Bishop e7. Bishop e2. Castle. Castle. b6. Shin, hedgehog variation. d5. Dli-Kasparov gambit. Knight c3. Taimanov variation. Knight f6. Knight bb5. Bishop b4. Knight d6. American attack. a6. Taimanov variation. Queen c7. Taimanov, Bastrikov variation. Bishop e3. Taimanov variation. a6. Bishop e2. Taimanov variation. d6. Sicilian. b4. Wing gambit deferred. Bishop b5. Moscow attack. Bishop d7. Kanal-Sokolsky attack. Bishop takes d7. Queen takes d7. Castle. Knight c6. c3. Knight f6. d4. Bramstein gambit. Queen takes d7. c4. Sokolsky variation. d4. C takes d4. Queen takes d4. Chekhov variation. Knight c6. Bishop b5. Queen d7. Zitsev variation. Knight takes d4. Sicilian. Knight f6. f3. Moscow variation. e5. Bishop b5. Venice attack. Knight c3. Sicilian. e5. Bishop b5. Venice attack. Knight c6. Sicilian. Bishop c4. Zin, not Scheveningen. g6. Knight takes c6. B takes c6. e5. Magnus Smith trap. Queen b6. Zin, Benko variation. Knight c6. d4. C takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight f6. Knight c3. d6. Bishop e2. Sicilian, Classical. e5. Boleslavsky variation. Knight takes c6. Lomer variation. Knight b3. Boleslavsky variation. Knight c6. Bishop g5. Richter-Rauzer. Bandarevsky variation. Bishop d7. Richter-Rauzer. Queen d2. Larsen variation. e6. Richter-Rauzer. Knight b3. Podvabrady variation. Bishop b5. Alekhine variation. Knight takes c6. Richter attack. Queen d3. Keres variation. Queen d2. Richter-Rauzer. Bishop e7. Rauzer attack. Castle queenside. Castle. f4. Rauzer attack. e5. Geller variation. Knight takes d4. Rauzer attack. Queen takes d4. Bishop e7. Defense. Knight takes d4. a6. Richter-Rauzer. Castle queenside. Bishop d7. Rauzer attack. a6. Defense. f4. Bishop e7. Rauzer attack. a6. Defense. Knight f3. b5. Bishop takes f6. Rauzer attack. a6. Defense. g6. Sicilian Dragon variation. f4. Dragon, 11 fish variation. Knight bd7. 11 fish. Flower variation. Bishop e3. Sicilian Dragon. Bishop g7. Bishop e2. Dragon, Classical attack. Knight c6. Queen d2. Dragon, Classical, Amsterdam variation. Castle. Castle queenside. Grigoriev variation. Knight b3. Dragon, Classical, Nottingham variation. Castle. Dragon, Classical. Castle. f4. Queen b6. e5. Zalmer gambit. Queen d2. Richter variation. Knight b3. Dragon, Classical. Bishop e6. f4. Knight a5. f5. Bishop c4. Knight takes a5. Bishop takes e2. Queen takes e2. Queen takes a5. g4. Stockholm attack. Bishop d3. Spielmann variation. Bishop takes d3. C takes d3. d5. Bernard defense. Queen c8. Reditar takeover variation. a5. Alekhine variation. f3. Dragon, Yugoslav attack. Castle. Yugoslav attack. Queen d2. Knight c6. Castle queenside. Rauzer variation. Knight c6. Bishop c4. Yugoslav attack. a5. Bern variation. Bishop d7. Yugoslav attack. Castle queenside. Yugoslav attack. Queen a5. Bishop b3. Rook fc8. h4. Yugoslav attack. e6. Scheveningen variation. Bishop e3. a6. Queen d2. English variation. Bishop b5. Vitolins variation. g3. Fianchetto variation. g4. Keres attack. f4. Knight c6. Bishop e3. Bishop e7. Queen f3. Scheveningen, Tal variation. Bishop e2. Scheveningen. Knight c6. Modern Scheveningen. Castle. Bishop e7. Bishop e3. Castle. f4. Main line. Bishop d7. Knight b3. Main line with knight b3. a6. Paulsen. Castle. Knight bd7. Classical. Knight d7. System. Queen c7. Paulsen. f4. Knight c6. Scheveningen. Classical variation with queen c7. And knight c6. King h1. Bishop e7. a4. Scheveningen. Classical. Murat C system. Bishop e3. Scheveningen. Classical. Bishop e7. Queen e1. Castle. Scheveningen. Classical main line. Bishop c4. Sicilian attack. a6. Bishop b3. b5. Sicilian with a6. And b5. Knight c6. Sicilian. Lenhardt variation. Bishop b3. Bishop e7. Bishop e3. Castle. f4. Sicilian. Fischer variation. Bishop e3. Sicilian. Bishop e7. Queen e2. Volimirovic attack. a6. Najdorf. h3. Adams attack. Bishop c4. Lipnitsky attack. Bishop e3. English attack. g3. Najdorf, Zagreb, Fianchetto variation. Bishop e2. Najdorf, Opavsensky variation. f4. Najdorf. Bishop g5. Najdorf. Knight bd7. Bishop c4. Queen a5. Queen d2. e6. Castle queenside. b5. Bishop b3. Bishop b7. Rook he1. Knight c5. e5. Ivkov variation. e6. Najdorf. f4. Najdorf b5. Pelageyevsky variation. e5. d takes e5. f takes e5. Queen c7. Queen e2. Simagin variation. Queen b6. Najdorf. Queen d2. Queen takes b2. Rook b1. Queen a3. Poison pawn variation. Bishop e7. Najdorf. Queen f3. h6. Bishop h4. Queen c7. Brown variation. g5. Argentine variation. Queen c7. Najdorf variation. Castle queenside. Knight bd7. Najdorf, bishop e7. Main line. The end.